Welcome to Session 6. This week we will be exploring the connection between learning outcomes and assessment strategies. More specifically, we will be reviewing the concept of backward design, sometimes referred to as understanding by design.
Before I explain what backward design is, it is important to understand what it is not. Backward design departs from the traditional approach to curriculum development. Under the traditional approach, curriculum development is often not first and foremost centered on the knowledge and skills that the learners will need, nor on how educators will know when the learners reach some level of competency. Many compare traditional curriculum design to setting out on a road trip and not knowing where one is going and not knowing how one will know when he or she gets to the destination. With the traditional approach to curriculum development, the focus is on the textbooks and the learning activities rather than on the desired results or learning outcomes that the curriculum is founded on. However, when using backward design, the focus is first and foremost on the learning outcomes, not the textbooks, readings, themes, or activities that will be done as part of the curriculum. In this sense, backward design focuses on curriculum planning with the end in mind. To begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means you know where you're going in regards to the learning process so that the steps you take with the learners are always in the right direction. It's about starting with your learning outcomes. This slide summarizes the basics of backward design. Backward design urges educators to begin their planning by asking, what is critical for learners to know, understand, and be able to do by the end of this curriculum? The learning outcomes. It then guides educators to ask, what assessment evidence do I need to gather to prove that learners have learned these learning outcomes? Finally, it requires educators to plan a sequence of learning experiences or activities that will prepare the learners to be successful on critical assessment tasks that will, in turn, provide evidence they learned the essential learning outcomes. For the purposes of this session, we will only be focusing on steps 1 and 2. Next week, we'll be discussing the third step and the development of learning activities in relation to assessment strategies. So let's take a closer look at the first step in backward design. This step relates to what we discussed in session 5. It focuses on what is critical for learners to know, be able to understand, and do by the end of the curriculum. In order to determine what is critical for learners to know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a curriculum, backward design theorists tell us that we should focus on creating learning outcomes that emphasize learners' enduring understandings. So how do we determine what enduring understanding is, and how do we develop learning outcomes that will allow us to get to this enduring understanding amongst our learners? Well, to determine this enduring understanding level, we can ask ourselves the following questions. What has value beyond the classroom or formal learning experience? What is worth knowing as practicing health professionals? What provokes deep thought, lively discussion, sustained inquiry, and new understanding as well as more questions? And what encourages learners to consider alternatives, weigh evidence, support their ideas, and justify their answers? The answers to these particular questions can help you develop learning outcomes that are geared at promoting enduring understanding amongst your learners. Once we figure out what the enduring understanding should be for our curriculum, we can begin to develop learning outcomes for it. As we discussed in session 5, we have to ask ourselves the following questions. What do we want learners to know and be able to do by the end of the curriculum? What specific insights and big ideas do we want learners to leave with? And we need to think about using verbs as discussed in session 5 to assist us in the development of these learning outcomes. Once the learning outcomes for the curriculum and learners have been established, we can move on to step 2 in backward design. Step 2 focuses on what assessment evidence we need to gather to prove that the learners have learned the learning outcomes. The type of assessment evidence that we need to collect will be dictated by the assessment strategies that we decide to use. The following chart illustrates examples of commonly used assessment strategies. Some people consider this to be an assessment continuum because as one moves from the top to the bottom, each assessment strategy becomes more complex. To reiterate, where learning outcomes fall on the following diagram will influence what type of assessment strategies one decides to use. The literature suggests that when assessing for things worth being familiar with, we tend to use quizzes and tests. To assess things that relate to enduring understanding, as well as things that are important for the learners to know and do, we tend to rely more heavily on performance-based assessments. As we discussed in session 5, Miller's pyramid is often referenced or referred to as a useful model with respect to assessment in health professions education. As Steve Downing, an expert in assessment, points out, cognitive knowledge is at the base of the pyramid upon all other important features of learning in health professions rests. Downing notes that the nose level of Miller's pyramid is best measured by written objective tests, where there are right and wrong answers. The knows-how level, on the other hand, requires learners to tailor their knowledge and demonstrate their knowledge within specific cases or contexts. This level can again be assessed with tests, however, some educators also use oral examinations at this level. Thus, the first two levels focus on learners' abilities to describe knowledge rather than on doing or applying it within a real-life setting. Moving on, the shows how level transitions into performance-based assessment. At this level, simulation is commonly used where assessments are occurring in controlled settings. Finally, Miller's does level indicates the highest level of assessment and is focused on independent and free-range observations of the learner's performance in clinical settings, often with real patients. This is where we see again performance-based assessment, but also workplace or work-based assessment being used. However, the types of assessment strategies included in the previous slides are only snapshots of commonly used assessment strategies in health professions education. This slide here highlights the range of assessment strategies used in the field. I have uploaded one learning activity for you to work through this week in regards to this week's topic. It is related to assignment number 3. The details for this learning activity can be found in the Module 6 Learning Activity folder.